Let's talk to Jonathan Sacerdoti, writer and broadcaster, about that. Jonathan, was it right for David Lammy to put those sanctions and travel bans on those two ministers?
I think those UK sanctions on the two Israeli ministers are really a grave strategic and moral error. And I think that's because it's not principled at all. It's some sort of partisan posturing, which is driven clearly by Labour's domestic politics, not by Britain's national interests. And I think that it's a dangerous double standard. It's not what they do to other countries. It emboldens terrorists and it undermines our allies. Israel is meant to be a strong ally of the UK at its moment of need during this existential war that it's fighting and doing quite well in, one must say. Britain is trying to throw it under the bus before it gets to finish off the job properly.
Well, indeed, as you say, I certainly agree with you. It is partisan posturing and it's driven by national politics rather than anything else. And getting a nice little round of applause from people waving the Palestinian flags and Labour backbenchers. But at the end of the day, it doesn't achieve anything. It doesn't actually make any difference to anything. Those two ministers, I mean, they're not even very popular in Israel, are they not? I don't think they're even very popular within the cabinet. We know that the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had to put together a coalition. His coalition could fall at any time, could even, who knows, today. It could fall at any time if these ministers leave his government. And so, that's what happens when you have coalition governments. But it doesn't serve any purpose. It's not going to change Israeli policy. I'm sure it's not going to change the minds of these two ministers, with whom I do disagree quite fundamentally when it comes to the West Bank settlements. And at a time when, I say, our only proper real ally as a democratic state in the Middle East is under so much pressure and fighting a war in Gaza.
Well, just in case people listening or watching don't know how Israeli politics works, you're exactly right that Israel is always pretty much governed by coalitions. We in the UK aren't. And so these two figures actually represent a very small part of the democratic vote, but they end up holding quite a bit of power because they hold together the coalition. But Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich are not the prime minister. They don't even really have much of a say in the actual war cabinet and how Israel is conducting the war. And so making them the bogeyman, I think, is bizarre. But on the other hand, maybe Benjamin Netanyahu, who is a mainstream, very popular politician in Israel. I mean, he's really held office as prime minister and in other major roles for decades. He perhaps gets a bit of the heat off him because they've got a new bogeyman. Often those in the West focus on him as some kind of disaster far-rightist when he's actually basically centre-right traditionally. And so maybe that's allowed him a bit of wriggle room. But I would also say that this ignores the Palestinian Authority's actions. For example, their pay-for-slay policy. They pay salaries to convicted terrorists. The more Israelis you've killed, the higher that salary. We don't see David Lammy saying anything about that or sanctioning anyone in that government, which isn't democratic as well. I mean, it's a would-be state, which is a tyranny run by people who were, if they were elected ever, it was a very, very long time ago, who are actively calling for, and in effect, they are effectively calling for terrorism and killing and rewarding it with money. And yet David Lammy isn't sanctioning those people like Mahmoud Abbas. He's sanctioning members of the Israeli government, members of the Israeli cabinet.
I'm quite sure the Israeli government is far too sensible. They're fighting a war. They've got other things to deal with this. But do you think a lot of this, and I know, look, I read a lot of what you've been putting on social media and sort of criticisms of people in the media, including one of my former colleagues, Piers Morgan, as well. And I have to say, I fully agree with your criticisms of him in terms of his treatment of the rather brilliant Natasha Hausdorff. I think just shouting the word BS at someone when you've invited them on a show is perhaps an interesting technique in broadcasting. But you and I know also share a lot of criticism of the BBC in terms of their broadcasting. Is it not a part of the problem we've got is that I mean, I get lots of people I know in this country who had no real views on what was going on in the Middle East, are now violently anti-Israel, saying that Israel is committing a genocide, starving the people of Gaza, and doing terrible deeds that are totally unjustified, because they see reports in the BBC and elsewhere, they hear what the government says, and they believe that that is actually what is happening, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
Yes, I do think that's quite a big part of it. That's one part of it. Other parts, you mentioned Piers Morgan. He called me a disingenuous twerp for daring to speak out against him hectoring and shouting expletives over Natasha Hausdorff, the international lawyer, when he invited her on his show. The thing about all of these people is partly it's influence of those falsities and lies that are being spread and unfortunately spread by mainstream media. But also there are other factors at play. I mean, when I say there's a double standard here, we don't see Britain putting similar sanctions on leading members of the Qatari government, but exactly. Qatar is funding Hamas for years.
Yeah, we roll out the red carpet for them.
Exactly. Well, listen, but that we know why, because many people have commented that Piers Morgan recently had a trip to Qatar. Qatar owns 95% of the building I think you're sitting in, and much of the surrounding areas. News UK
most of London.
Housed. Well, yeah, exactly. It's not something I'm alleging has influenced your coverage, but I am saying that the fact of the matter is when there's money involved, different people suddenly switch their values. And in this case, I think that David Lammy is forgetting that it's not all just about money. Sometimes there are principles and morals at play. And
I think it's more about people wanting to say the things that they think people will think they're a nice person for, as opposed to what they believe to be right. But I'm old-fashioned like that. Can we just talk about Greta Thunberg as well? She did her Freedom Flotilla with their symbolic amount of aid. Well, it was an aid ship, and then it turned out a couple of bags of flour, and it was a symbolic aid trip to get to Gaza. It didn't get into Gaza, got intercepted. She claimed yet again, not in a video before she was actually intercepted, but also afterwards at the airport, that she had been kidnapped by Israeli forces. She was deported. She agreed to be deported. A number of people on the flotilla, they're now having to it'll take a few days, but they will be deported. But she got diesel-powered yacht and then a plane home. I mean, her carbon footprint is I'm very distressed by. Will someone not think of the planet? But what do you make of her using the phrase "we were kidnapped"?
How dare she? Is all I have to say about that. I mean, listen, this woman child saying kidnapped. I mean, let's not forget who's really been kidnapped here. Over 200 people were kidnapped from Israel by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists on October the 7th, 2023. It's a long time ago. Over 50 still held in Gaza, many of them actually dead. This is horrific. So for this spoilt child to say that she has been kidnapped by the Israelis, when actually what they did is implement a fully legal naval blockade. The Palmer report in 2011 explained that this was legal. Israel's actions in intervening and this ridiculous floating photo op.
I've got about 3 seconds.
Totally legitimate.
Jonathan, I think we got the gist of that. Thank you so much. Jonathan Sanchez, writer and broadcaster. This is Talk.